Okay, so good evening and welcome everybody to the July edition of Jozipug Meetup. Just some quick notes as usual, just make sure you are staying on mute. There are a number of people on the call and any background noise can cause some disruptions. That being said though, if you do want to ask a question or comment on something, please feel free to come off mute. Also use the meeting chat as well. We will be monitoring it during the course of the session. So please feel free, engage, keep this interactive. We are all here to learn, so take advantage of it as much as possible. Okay, now let me just get my presentation back quickly. As I said, these meetings are recorded. We are uploading them onto our YouTube channel, so if you do need to drop off early, you can come back and watch the recording at a later stage, or if you just want to view what we talked about again, go check out those recordings. I do post them into the meeting chat once we're done. So just a high-level overview of what we're going to be discussing today. I'm just going to take you through some of the news and some of the items that is new inside PowerApps. Then Michael's going to step in and take us through his generic auditing app, which he has termed Wizard. Next, Dawid is going to be taking us through testing and monitoring Canvas apps, and then we're going to finish off with some general Q&A and discussions. So now, if we have a look at just what's in the news, some of the new things that are coming in some of the new features that we are testing out, we are bringing in the ability to use formulas with dynamic schemas in PowerApps. What this really means is when you are calling a data source, depending on the parameters that you're specifying, you can end up getting back different fields. And what that means is that schema is dynamic. It could change depending on how you are calling it. In the past, this has been a challenge, but now what you have the ability to do is when you are busy building out your formula, you have the option to go and capture the schema for this specific instance. So it can capture that set of values and save it, and you can utilize that throughout the rest of the app. This definitely does add some benefits to a lot of users. It might not be used by everyone, but this is currently in one of the experimental features. So if you want to try it out, just make sure you go to the experimental section inside PowerApps and make sure you go and turn that on, and then you would be able to start pulling through these items. We've also announced generally available AI models. We're bringing in 3 new models inside here. So we've got the entity extraction pre-built model, and that is going to be used to classify key elements in your text based on predefined entities that you have inside your environment. Now, for those of you who want to use custom entities, we do have the custom model as well for entity extraction. So that way you'll be able to go and define what your entities are, which ones you want to use, and then be able to train it with a few examples to get out what you need to at the end of the day, and then use those in your Power Apps and your flows and so on. And then we've also brought out the category classification custom model, which also allows you to classify text in your own domain specific categories. So that way you can train it with a small set of examples and then start pulling out the classification from lines of text that you could be using. And then once you've built it out, once again, you can go and use that in Power Apps or even in Power Automate. Now, one thing to note, these have been in trial for a while now. Now that they're moving to GA, you need to make sure that you do have the licenses required for that. So you either need a premium or AI Builder add-on license or an active trial to be able to utilize these new models. Sorry, that was just the one for the classification. Now, there is a new licensing model for Power Apps portals, which is capacity based. So you are going to have a way to go and change your environment. If you are currently on the standard license, you'll see when you go into that environment, you are going to get a pop-up message at the top talking about your licenses, and you can go and change that now. You can click directly on the link. We'll be sharing this presentation, so you'll be able to go in there, check it, and then you'd be able to update it and move it from the traditional license, where you are licensed per sign-on, and now you're going to be moving over to the capacity-based licensing model in portals. This is a lot more attractive for a lot of users, especially if you've got a lot of people accessing your PowerApps portals. Now, one of the other, I've got some formula updates. So I think one of these Dawid did mention in the previous one, possibly, or we discussed it separately. But in the past, there was a formula for show error. Now, this was very basic. There wasn't much involved in there, and it just kept it up for a certain period of time. What we've now done is we've changed this to now it's a lot more generic, and we call it notify, and you have the ability to specify how long that message stays up on the page. So this is the message that pops up at the top of the Power App, and it can display a specific message or give the person some more info. And in this case, you can say, okay, this is an error, or it is just a message, and you can go specify how long it sits at the top of the page for them. So this is great to use. Start playing around with it, check it out. You can change the seconds and the time that's displayed and so on. There is also a nice one now where it's launched to self. So instead of, if you usually in the past, when you were calling other Power Apps, you were asking it to launch another Power Apps, especially if you were working in a browser, it would go and open up a new window. Or if you were hyperlinking to a website, it would also open it up in a new tab. So now what you can do is you can say, okay, open it up, but stay within the same tab that you are in. This has been a request from a number of our customers to sort out. So this is now available. It does make it a lot easier to do. One other thing to know, I have finished the content for our Power Virtual Agents in a Day workshop. So we just want to get an understanding of who would be interested in this workshop. So if you are, please log on to that link below. I will be popping it into the chat once this is down, or you can scan that QR code currently and just go register your interest in the workshop. And also whether you would prefer to do this in an evening or split up over a couple of evenings, or if you would prefer it on a Saturday. So I just want to get an understanding from the community what the best options would be for you, what would work better for you. And then once we've got all that information, we'll look at setting up one in the next couple of weeks. Okay. So with that, I just want to open up the floor and see if there's anything else anyone wants to add, any new items that you may have heard of that I haven't covered. Okay,
Jonathan, there's just on that dynamic schema one, we've been using Power Automate to issue SQL queries directly to SQL in the past. And so what the dynamic schema now allows us to do is to consolidate all of our different flows that issue SQL queries into one, so that it's easy to monitor and all of these sort of things. So you don't have all of these flows connecting to different SQL databases. So that works very well, as well as the self operate or function, so that you can now, within a control, call itself. I think we spoke about, yes. I can't remember if we spoke about it last month.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think we might have spoke about it in our session with Michael previously. I did also see that. So instead of referencing something else, you can reference self, and that helps, especially when you're working on coordinates, and that's correct.
Yeah, so whenever you're doing styling and these sort of things, or when you want to set the border color of a control to be the same as the fill, just a little bit darker, for an example, so that it's very easy to just reference itself. And also saw that some of the controls that on the pre-baked applications from PowerApps now also use that self property. So that's working very, very nicely.
Okay, great. Good to hear. Thanks, Dawid. Okay, so with that, Mike, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through your awesome Wizard app that you've built out. I love the background.
Yeah, it's so cold here that I thought, just bit of fire, then we're all good, eh? Cool. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. I get the awesome privilege of showing an app that I've been working on. Before I show it to you, I definitely need to thank Dawid and Jonathan for helping me with this app. I'm always learning. You never complete when it comes to building PowerApps. So I lean on them quite regularly. So thanks, guys, for your help and advice in this app. And I'm pretty sure as I go through the session, whoever's got questions, just shout out, and I can show you anything under the covers when it comes to this app. I'm showing my desktop. You can see it, right?
Yes.
It's just a slide. Okay,
yeah.
Cool, awesome.
Exactly.
So maybe just to give you a bit of background in terms of what this app is and where it is in its life cycle. I wanted to create an application, a Canvas app that you could put onto mobile phones or tablets that allows people to go and do audits or inspections. I get a lot of requests for inspection type of form filling, essentially. So, someone goes out to a specific building to do an inspection, or you might be doing an inspection on a car, or you might be doing an audit on a facility or a shop. So that was the idea, but I also wanted it to be useful for wizard type of applications as well, where you ask a set of questions, on screen 1, then going to screen 2, screen 3. So essentially kind of like filling in a form. And I wanted to make the app reusable. So what happens today is a lot of people, when they create these types of apps, they will essentially hard code the controls on the screen. And so you have to create, if you're going to do 13 different types of inspections with different fields or audits or wizards, you'll have to create 13 different apps or 13 different screens. And I didn't want that. I wanted the screens to dynamically build themselves. And so to go and define the fields that make up these questions on these apps somewhere, and then the Canvas app just builds itself, essentially. And that would help not only customers and partners, but it would help me also demo apps a lot faster. So I don't have to build apps every time to create a demo. And so this was the idea behind the app. I didn't know what to call this thing. So I said, okay, cool. It's not really a wizard application, and it's not really like an audit application. So we'll combine wizard and audit and come up with a wizard. And you can see the spelling there. So I still consider this is a sample app. You're all welcome to have the source code to it. It's certainly not complete. It's not fully functional, but it's a good starter, I guess. It's a sample. Use it if you want. There's good learnings from it. I thought it was quite interesting to try and create an app that generates controls. So this is what it is. It's called Wizard. And just something else I wanted to point out, because I got some inspiration from this application. So this is an app that's just on the PowerApps blog, the Microsoft PowerApps blog. And this does something somewhat similar, but not exactly the same. And it generates screens like this employee onboarding screen over here, this form, essentially. And it's also a wizard style approach to it. It generates this based on a business process flow. So you create a business process flow in model-driven applications, and then it renders itself based on this. So I looked at this. It's very clever. It's quite complicated. If you thinking of complication in terms of 0 to 10, this is at the 9 level. It's super complicated. What I've created is also fairly complicated. So if you're a beginner, this might frighten you a little bit. Don't be too afraid. Maybe this is a 6 or a 7, what I've assembled, but also, I guess, slightly different to this. But this is where the inspiration came from and some of the ideas that I had in terms of building this thing. So I guess that's it for the intro. Let me kind of jump into first the Canvas app, just to show you kind of what this looks like. Just something else to note, it also supports offline capability. So you can use this application totally offline. You can fill in an audit or an inspection or a wizard offline. And then when there's connectivity, you can upload that completed wizard or form. So let me first show you the Canvas app, then I'll show you how you define the questions, and then we'll kind of unpack the Canvas app. Everyone all good? Just give me a nod from someone.
Yep.
Yep, all
Okay,
good.
cool.
Mike, I think
awesome.
just on this, the look and feel of this app is just so nice and clean, man. Well done with that.
Thanks. I once again, I get inspiration from others. I go and find apps that I think look cool and I try and copy them. I'm not a great UI expert. But anyway, so here we are. This app only has 2 screens. It's got your kind of welcome screen, which you see here. And then it's got the actual screen that generates the questions. So let's start here. Let's just run the app. And I'm obviously logged in, and it's giving me different wizards I can go and complete. So I can complete a vehicle inspection or a store safety inspection or a Wi-Fi request. If I go to waiting for upload, there's nothing currently waiting for upload. So if I just go back here, let's go and do a Wi-Fi request wizard. Think of it as a form. And so when I do the Wi-Fi request, you would have seen it kind of created the screen, and now I can go and fill it in. And basically the way it works is, actually I don't like this one. Let's just go back here. Let's do a vehicle inspection rather. So vehicle inspection has got different field types, so that's why I wanted to choose this one. And if a field is required, you get a little red thing here. I can't hit save or submit because I haven't filled in all the required fields. So the vehicle registration that I'm going to do this on is called, let's do something like that. And I'm going to inspect the vehicle. So the brake pads fail, and they are bad, or the notes I'm going to put in, okay? And the assessment date that I actually did this on was, let's say this date over there. And the sump plug, you know, will pass that. The brake pads front will pass that. And the windscreen wipers, hey, what? We'll just pass those as well. So you can kind of get the idea. I'm now just going to hit save. And so what's happened now is I haven't actually submitted it off to a database yet because I could be offline. And I can't mimic offline here. I actually should have done this on my phone, but anyway. And so now if I go to waiting to upload, you'll see there is that one that I filled in. I can go and complete some more. So I can go and do the Wi-Fi request now as well. So my name is Michael. I need Wi-Fi for my iPhone, and I need Wi-Fi. So this, you can imagine, some businesses actually do this. You need to fill in a form like this to get access to Wi-Fi. Business justification, I just need Wi-Fi, okay? My email address, and the building I'm in. And actually, this is a text field. I should have made this a date field, but anyway, just whatever. So if I go to waiting for upload, you'll see there's 2 that I've got right now, vehicle inspection and Wi-Fi request. I can go back to the vehicle inspection and it'll load it again. And maybe now I'm connected. If I hit submit, just remember this. There we go. Hit submit. And submit would only show if I actually had connectivity. You'll see it's now gone from waiting to upload because it's actually submitted that back into the database. In this case, I'm using CDS for everything. What I'll do is I'll just leave it like that for now. Okay, so how is this app constructed? So the first part is actually the model-driven app. So this is kind of, if you want to call this the admin app. And so this is where you go and define your wizards. So you can see here, I've got my wizard definitions. I've created 3: store, safety, vehicle, and Wi-Fi request, which is obviously the 3 that you saw the user, could go and complete. And if I wanted to create another one, I'd just click new, and then I could go and create another one. And then suddenly that person would have a new type of form that they could fill in, a new wizard. If I go to vehicle inspection, let's just open up this one. They're fairly simple right now. A wizard has a name. I have some ideas, stuff that I want to add. So for example, include a final signature. So the last field should be a signature field. Essentially, someone could go and ink and put their signature on it to say that, yes, this audit or this inspection was done. Should it generate a PDF of the result and save that somewhere? Also, I haven't implemented this yet. These are just ideas. Start date and end date of when this is available for someone to consume. And then you go and define what questions you want. So you'll see these are the questions I went and added. The vehicle registration, the brake pads, you can see the data type of them. And essentially the way that this works is you go and click new field. Let me just go and edit an existing one. Let's take assessment date. And so here you'll see the assessment date is a date time field, but I could have dropped this down and said, actually, I want this to be a choice field, a text field, a yes, no, or yes, no, not applicable field. So it supports different field types, whether it's required or not, whether it should include notes. And you'll saw some of the fields had a note section underneath. So if I go and say yes, now when this renders in the Canvas app, you'll get a little notes field underneath it. So it's not just the assessment date, but there's notes. For example, pass fail, you might want notes underneath it. Visible or hidden. Include image, this is a future feature I want. So when I have each field, I can also take a picture. So brake pads failed, let's take a photo and add that in as well. Order determines what order it appears in the form, and sections determine, I've got different ideas around having this across multiple screens. So these could be screen 1 to 9 or sections 1 to 9. At the moment, everything is just in one long list, but that's the idea behind this. So yeah, I can go and define these, set the orders, as I said, a new field. If I hit this, I just get the slide out here and I can go and create a new field. Pretty cool. So that sets up your wizard, and then it just renders in the app. If I look at responses, this is where the responses come in. So I just did that one earlier. You saw GGG was the registration. So here it is. So here's our previous responses. I've got 2 Wi-Fi request responses before, 1 vehicle inspection. So now I've got 2 vehicle inspections. If I open that up, I'll then go and see the actual responses that were put in. Okay, and if I open a specific one, I'll also see the notes field associated if there was a notes field, or any notes taken. So there were no notes on this one because it didn't require notes. Which one did have notes? Was it the front page? I can't remember. Anyway, one of them had notes. Some plug. No. Anyway, so yeah, so that's essentially how it works. So now, as soon as I want a new one, I literally just go and define it here, set the questions, open up the app, and now I can go and fill it in. So maybe just a little bit of the deconstructing of how this works. And one of my learnings is if I just gave you this app, you wouldn't have a clue how it works. I've been debugging or looking at other apps over the past few weeks, and without comments, it's really hard to figure out what an app is actually doing. It's not like you can run it, in traditional code and you can step through it line by line and, debug variables and, you can figure out what it's doing. With PowerApps, it's actually quite hard. So commenting is really important. So if you do want a copy of this app, I have commented it. So hopefully that explains how it works. So let me just go through a little bit about it. So on this home screen, I've actually got 2 galleries, and I'll just show and hide them depending on which tab I select here. So waiting for upload is one gallery, and complete new wizard is a different gallery. So this gallery here is essentially the list of wizard definitions, right? So if I go to this gallery, there it is. And inside of this gallery, you'll see it binds to a collection, which is essentially that entity which holds the wizards. And if I look at something like the name, that's status. You'll see it's bound to the name. So essentially, this is the name. Here, there's the name. So that's what it's pulling in. So that's pretty much how that works. If I then go and fill in one of these forms, let's go to vehicle inspection. Yeah, let's do vehicle inspection. That's a more complicated one. Let's jump into the second screen. Essentially, this is a gallery. Okay, so in the gallery, I have a field, what should I say, a control for every data type I want to support. And what it's going to do, it's going to hide or show a column, or sorry, a control based on whether that field, what the data type of the current field is. So what's happening here is this gallery is bound to a collection of questions, okay, which is essentially this collections here. So this essentially is a collection. And so this is what the gallery is binding to. And then obviously as a record appears in the gallery, I need to determine what control to show or hide. So for example, accompanied by, actually let's go back to the vehicle inspection. If we look at something like vehicle registration, the data type of this is a single line versus assessment date, which is a date time. So if the current field's data type is single line, show, set the visible property to true of the text control. Whereas if it's date time, set the visible property of the date picker control to true and all of the others to false, essentially. So just to show you what that looks like, if I take something like the text box and I look at the visible property, you'll see visible is set to true only if the data type is single line or multi-line. Then it's going to show that text box. Otherwise, it'll be false. If I look at date picker and I look at the visible property, you'll see this is only going to be visible if the data type is date time for the current record. And so that will be visible. And that's how you dynamically, in quotes, create controls. They're actually always there. It's just they're not necessarily visible. So that's how you get this thing to looks like it's generating controls on the fly. The other thing is kind of like, well, how do I capture the data that the person's putting in? And so what you would typically use here, or what I've used, is the onChange event on each control. So if I go to onChange, in other words, someone's changing the text in the text box, I'm going to go and save the response. So I'm going to save the current value for this text box into a collection. I'm only doing it if the data type is single line or multi-line. This is just, you don't actually necessarily need this, but it just ensures, for example, that for some reason, even though the control's not visible, if the text in it changes, it's going to write it, and I don't want that to happen. I only want to write it because it's visible. In other words, it's the one that should be shown. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a patch command to write in the current value from the text box. So here I'm taking the value from the text box and I'm writing it into a collection of responses. So if I look at this collection, let's do that. There it is. You'll see I've got this collection of responses. So I just created a new /empty form. So you'll see the actual answers aren't in here. So I've got all the questions, vehicle registration, brake pads, etc. but the actual responses, the answers aren't in here yet. And only when I start changing them for each one of these, the patch command will run. It'll take the current value of the current field, whether it's, current control, date, picker, text box, radio buttons, whatever, and then it's going to write the value into here. So just to give you a quick view of what I mean, if I go in here now and I put in a registration, my reg, and I change that to fail, let's just break out now and go back to my text box. You'll see, there we go, my reg is now in the response for that record. Pretty cool. And so then essentially right at the end, when I save or submit, I'm taking this collection and I'm either saving it as a collection for later use, and in offline you can save collections onto the mobile device for later use, or I'm taking this collection and I'm submitting it into CDS. I do slight manipulations on the collection before I submit it into CDS, but that's essentially what I'm doing. I have to do some stuff to make sure we don't get duplicate rows and a few other things. But yeah, that's essentially how this thing is working. Questions? Do you want me to go into more details? Dawid, Jonathan, any stuff specifically you want me to show?
I think you've covered all the aspects that are important and taken them through it. Yeah, no, it looks great, man. It's come a long way.
I think there are many questions.
Yeah. Would it be possible to quickly see some of the manipulations that you do before you submit to CDS? By the way, it's Andrew.
Yeah.
Yep.
How's it, Andrew? How's it? Yes. I recognize the voice.
Sweet. I'm famous. Woo.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's I need to do some better logic here. I need to do some checking to see that the record actually exists and stuff like that. But what actually happens is there's two entities in CDS that I'm writing to. The first entity that I'm writing to is actually like the name of the whole response. So, hey, there's a record response. So that's the one entity, and the other one is actually the values of the fields. So if you go back here, if I look at responses, you'll see one entity holds these responses here. Okay, which is, the title of the response, what type of wizard it was, who created it, when they created it. Essentially this piece here. And then the second entity holds all the responses. So all the responses sit in one entity, and you can imagine it's got a question text column and a question response column, a notes column. So those are the two things I need to write. I need to write this one record and then all of these records. And what I do when I write them is this I write as one record. And then in theory, if this is successful, then I write this. But I don't write these as individual records. One of the new features you can do now is you can submit an entire collection in one go, in one command, and it'll write all of these in one go. So what I do is I have to take that collection before I submit it and just rename some of the columns so that they match the columns in CDS. So that's what I'm doing in this button here. So I'll actually work backwards. So this one here is writing all the responses into CDS, into one entity called the field responses entity. But before I write this entire collection, you'll see there's the collection. Before I do this, I actually shape this collection. So you'll see there's this function here where I create a collection where I go and rename some columns. I add another column because I have to add a column to reference the parent, which is the responses. So you'll see here, this is an added column so that I've created a relationship between the two entities of each field response to the parent response object. So that's working backwards. And then over here, you'll see this is where I actually go and patch. This is where I go and write a new record into the response entity. So write the response, then go and write all the actual fields responses. Kind of hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. That's very cool. I've done something similar to this using SharePoint as a backend source, and yeah, it was interesting trying to make sure you don't overwrite stuff and do other random stuff. But yeah, this is very lacquer.
Yeah. So basically here I need to just add one more condition before I go and write the record, is to make sure it doesn't already exist in the database. Otherwise I'm going to get duplicate responses. And obviously if it fails, then don't go and do this patch here of the actual responses. So, but that's minor. That'll take me probably 15-20 minutes to sort out.
Cool stuff.
Mark, there was just a question on how do you save the data when you are offline?
Oh, okay, cool. So let's go in here. So when you're offline, it's actually very simple. There's a save data function. So when you call save data, you give it a collection. So here's a collection, and then here's kind of like a key. This is the key that you would use to retrieve this later on. So the way offline works is it's all with collections. You save collections and you load collections. So here when I click save, it's going to save this collection onto the device. And then on app start, what I do is I load the collection. So on app start, let me just go back here to app start. I haven't showed you this, but on app start, you'll see I can actually go and load the collection, and that would come from the device rather than from the actual collection that's been created from the data source. And you can do stuff like, am I connected, am I not connected? So you can, get clever. But essentially the whole concept behind offline, it's really, really simple, is initially when your app kind of loads, you get your data from your data source and you save it. You save it onto the device's storage. Well, you first put it into a collection, and then you save that collection onto the device storage. Then essentially, if your app loads again and you're offline, so you're not connected, then just load that collection from device storage rather than loading it from data source. And then as you're working, you just continually save those data to collections. And then only at the end, when you're ready to actually submit it, then you can submit it off to the database if you're online. So a few other things I shouldn't actually, like I haven't got this logic here. I shouldn't show submit if I'm not connected. So if I'm not connected, hide submit. So there's a few little nuances I have to work on still to make sure that's all working. But in general, the offline capability is working perfectly. Obviously, initially you need to be online at some point in time to, get the initial data onto the device. But once it's on the device, I can create, I can go and complete all these applications, these forms, these wizards. I can save them, and then later on I can submit them. And my submit strategy here, there's lots of choices here. I could, instead of the way I'm doing it now is there's this thing of waiting to upload and then you have to go into it and hit submit. I could have a little timer that checks for reconnectivity and just takes what's ever in here. As soon as there's connectivity, it just uploads it. It all depends, I guess, on what you want to do. In this model, it means someone can also go and edit the form before submitting it. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you just have one submit button. You hit submit, and whether it's online, if it's online, it sends it. If it's not online, it saves it in storage, a timer. When it sees there's connection again, it just submits it, and you don't have an opportunity then, to re-edit the form before you submit it. There's a few options there, but that's just the way I chose to do it.
So Michael, just on that submitting as soon as it becomes connected, I can't remember if we've spoken about this, but what you could consider using as well is a toggle. And then for the default property for the toggle, you'll simply go and say connection.isConnected. So whenever it it's not connected, the toggle would be automatically turned off. But then when it becomes connected, the toggle would turn on, and then you can have a on select event, or on check, or I think it's on check. And then you write your formula to actually upload it on the on check, which means that as soon as it's connected, you don't have to have a timer that just polls it.
Oh, okay.
As soon as it becomes connected, then it'll upload the data.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, so yeah, there's lots of strategies. You know, maybe I could have a button here, submit all. You know, there's a few things. Other things I want you as a little recycle bin to delete these. Actually, I don't want to now submit it, delete it. So yeah, there's a few things I can certainly improve there. I do have a plane icon. So there's a little airplane icon here. It's only visible. If I go to visible, you'll see this is airplane icon only becomes visible if it's actually connected. So if I do go offline, I'll get a little plane icon here to show me that I'm not connected. And then in theory, I'll need to toggle the buttons so that they work differently depending on whether I'm connected or not. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things I could change there.
Nice. Andrew, do you have a question? I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add something in. I've actually done a lot of offline apps. And just one of the things that I did find that I think would be quite useful to share with the forum is, you know, when you loading up your app, you say load data and you give the name of your cache file. That cache file remains on the device. If you have multiple apps and you happen to be a creature of comfort and you use the same naming convention, if two apps have the same cache file, you can corrupt the data in it that the other app is expecting to have. So it's just something that I found, I learned the hard way, but yeah, I thought it might just be useful just to add in that just use different cache files. Microsoft may have changed it since I last did that, but yeah, just to put it out there.
Wow.
I don't want to know the kind of troubleshooting you had to do to figure that out, because it's like...
There was very significant times, you know, smash forward on keyboard to continue. But yes, that was pretty much it. You're reading data and it's like, this is not my data. Oh, yeah. So it probably would be a good idea probably for us to go to user voice and maybe do some sort of encryption on it, because for troubleshooting and stuff, what we actually ended up doing was writing another app to read out the data that was in the cache file to see what had and had not synchronized, because we had some consistency issues between for another day. But yes, it is useful, and I thought, you know, free advice for those who actually want to dabble in the offline stuff, because offline stuff is brilliant.
That sounds like the kind of
Awesome.
The kind of troubleshooting that you don't want your kids to see you and the kind of person you turn into when you work with that.
Oh, very much so, especially when you sit in the open plan office. Fantastic.
Awesome, Mike. Very good, man.
Cool.
That's that's an awesome app. I think this thing is going to get some real long legs. I think there's a lot of very cool stuff you can do with this app. It definitely feels like it's going places.
Thanks. Yeah, and if anyone wants it, just, you know, drop me a mail. I'll share it. I'll probably put it onto GitHub as soon as it's a little bit further of where I want it to be, and then yeah, just treat it as a sample. It's not it's not production ready, but some really cool learnings, I'm sure.
No, there's. Thanks a lot, Mike. Really appreciate that. So
cool. Thanks, team.
Okay, so with that, Dawid, we hand it over to you. Sorry, Andrew, your hand is still up. Do you have another question? Okay, perfect.
Sorry, forgot to put it down. Sorry, mate.
No problem. Floor's yours, Dawid.
All right, cool. So, Mike, I think it's actually quite interesting. You know, you mentioned that it's difficult to step through PowerApps and you know, the formulas and these sort of things. So I think we're actually going to get to that in the second part of what I'm going to show you today. So hopefully that works in future. But to start off with, we're going to talk about testing and more specifically automated testing. And I'm sure that's something that makes people excited in general. I mean, everybody just loves testing, right? So what we're going to be showing you today is how you can automate some of your testing effort on PowerApps. So I'm going to just share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. All right, so what I'm going to do, just first of all, I'm going to create a very basic application to just show you the concept of how you would put together the test cases and the test suites and the cases then underneath that, and how you can then easily run those test scenarios in future. And I think it's one of those things that the first time you work with the test cases, it feels like an absolute daunting task to set up all of your different scenarios. And it's a lot of work to do that. But the more time you spend on that up front, the more stable your app would be throughout its entire life. And I can't emphasize that enough. And you typically don't see the benefits when you create your first or your app originally, because it feels like, I've created my app and now I need to tell it what to test. And most of your test cases would work initially. But that's not where the value comes in. The value comes in a year or two from now when somebody works on this app, and that somebody might as well be you. And now you change something and you tweak something, and there's no way for you to literally test every use case in the app manually. And this is what this is then designed to pick up and then prevent from going into production. Right, so I'm just going to create a very basic app. I'm going to create a 2-screen app, and let's just call this list screen. And so after Michael's app, this is going to be a very, very basic app. So, this is something that I can also understand. So if we go and add a label to it, just so that we can see at the time of testing it which screen we're actually on, so we don't get confused with that. And then the value of that, we're just going to do app.activeScreen .name. Right, so that's just going to show the name of the screen that's currently displayed
Dawid,
in.
Yes. I don't think we're seeing what you're typing.
Not. What are you seeing?
A pop-up window. We're just seeing the staff onboarding.
That shouldn't be right. So is that better?
There we go. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So there's my app with the 2 screens. We've got a list screen and a data screen with just 2 labels at the top to show which one is currently selected. And then we're going to add a button on the first screen that is going to navigate to the next one. So navigate to the data screen. And then we're going to have, let's just call that do data. And now we're going to have that same button on the other screen to just say to list. And that's going to take us to the list screen. All right, so there's no rocket science over here. That's just basically going to flip between these 2 screens when we click on it. All right, so nothing too hairy there. Let's add a text input as well to just show you. It's not going to do anything. It's just going to sit there and we're going to be able to populate it with some data. All right, so this is now the application, and let's pretend that this is the one that we've been working on for weeks. And we now want to go and build in our test cases into this application. So let's just call this the test application. You have to save it and you have to publish the application in order for the tests to run. So you might say, but how does it work that you have to publish your app? Because that means that the users are going to get the changes that you're busy with. And the short answer to that is If your environments are set up correctly, your users shouldn't be accessing the same app in which you're busy making changes and testing. So if you publish that app, it doesn't make it available to the users, it just simply makes it available in that environment, but your production environment still stays intact. And I know that a lot of sites don't operate like that because they might not have capacity for additional environments, but that's just definitely something to keep in mind. Right, so on the left, you'll see that there are advanced tools, and underneath that, we've got monitoring and testing. And both of these are on preview, and we're going to be discussing both of these during today's session. So if we could click on Open Tests, we just need to go and enable formula in the settings of the app. We need to go and enable formula level error management. That's important, otherwise the testing doesn't work. Okay, so just go back in and save that. I don't think it's going to need me to restart this app. I don't think so, but let's go and test. So on the left hand side, if we click on Advanced, we can click on Open Tests. And this now opens the Test Studio. And this basically uses the same Selenium engine than the UI flows does, that does the recordings. So if we now look at the screen, we'll see on the top we've got Suite, and that's where you can group multiple test cases together. So let's call this test all functionality. And then underneath that, you've got your various test cases. So it's a good idea to keep your test cases as small as possible and rather split them into multiple test cases than having one test case with 100 steps in them. So let's go and say, as an example, this might be your create case 04, depending on if you really do this properly, you can actually tie this back to your technical specifications and your functional specifications. So you can now name these things correctly, and then you can add new cases underneath your suite. So that might be a create. Then underneath that, we might have an approval and that's number 08 according to your documentation. And then you can actually record the steps that each one of these cases should walk through at the time of running. And it's important to understand that these cases underneath your suite can either be run individually, or you can run the entire suite, in which case it's going to run one case after the other in the same app session. So where the last step of your first case is where the first step of your second case is going to start. All right, so you can easily just strip or create smaller cases instead of just having one big one. So for now, I'm just going to create a test case, and you'll see that over here we don't have any steps at the moment, and that's where we can go and click on record at the top. And it's now going to allow me to interact with the published version of this app, and as I interact with the controls on the screen, it's actually going to record what I'm doing with them. So first of all, let's go and capture the name Mike in this text input field for whatever reason, and we can now click on to data. You'll see on the left hand side, before we do, it says the first action that we've done is to select the text input 1 control. Sorry, I didn't name these controls properly, but you should get the gist of it. So there you'll see that we've now changed the text property of the text input to Mike, and we now clicked on the select button. And we can now jump between these two screens a few times, and every time we do, it's going to record that in the step recorder. So if you now click on done, it's going to write what you've done back into a format which the player understands. So there you'll see it tells you that you've set the text input .text, and here's the formula that you can now go and manipulate. So if for whatever reason you want to change this to Joe instead of Mike, you can do it directly in the action. You don't have to go and re-record those steps. This will now actually connect to that property in the browser and set it to Joe instead of Mike. To be politically correct, you can also just update the step name, because that now still says Mike. It doesn't really matter, but it does. So you can keep your names for each steps accurate as well. All right, so to go and play this now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. First, you have to save it. And now publish it. Now, this isn't only publishing the test cases, it's publishing the entire application. And it's important to understand that the test cases and the test suites are contained in the application. So if I export this app and import it into another environment, all of those test cases reside in the app, so you can always fire off testing in the app regardless of where it is. So that's very cool, and it's very important to understand that. So now I can go and click on play, and that's going to go and launch the application in published mode in the player that the normal users would access it, and it'll go and execute all of those steps on the application and make sure that it can find the controls that it needs to interact with and that the controls respond accordingly. Okay, so there our test case has completed and it was successful. In this instance, I just ran a test against the case. Similarly, I could have done that against the entire suite. In this case, it wouldn't have made a difference because we only have one case. Right, so any questions at this stage? So at this, we've now played it using the play button at the top, and you'll see right next to that is a copy play link. And if you click on that, you'll see it gives you quite a significantly sized link, which you can then use to execute this play or this test suite from other applications. So think of DevOps or think about automated deployment, where before you move an app from one environment to the next, you typically want to put it through its use cases and its unit testing to make sure that everything is still working the way that it's intended to. And then only when everything succeeds do we then want to move it on to the next environment. So you'll typically copy this link and then give it to whatever platform you use to do or to manage your ALM. And one thing to keep in mind is how would that then know whether the test case has succeeded or not? And if you've thought about that, that's a very good question, because at the moment, none of our test case information or the results of it are saved anywhere. It's just available in the session, but we're not saving that anywhere at the moment. And this brings us to the result steps. And you'll see at the top, it says the result steps are not currently applied. So if we click on that, we'll see that there are a couple of things that we can do with this. The first one is every time a test case starts, we can issue a formula. And this is normal PowerApps formulas. And this formula is executed from within the application. So in the context of the application that we're working in, this formula will execute. Then after each test case completes, you can then also fire off or trigger a formula. And then when every test suite completes, then you can also trigger off a formula. So if we go and have a look at, there's a specific object that is created as part of the test case, and this is called a test case result. And if you go and extract this information, you'll see that these are the properties that it saves throughout the test case. So you can either save this information into SharePoint or into SQL or into CDS. It really doesn't matter. I prefer to send this all to Flow, which means that Flow then can trigger certain logic and functionality on the results of the test case and then make certain decisions. So an example, you could then automate the deployment of moving an application to another environment based on the test case results. So I'm going to not build this into here. I've got another app that I'm going to show you that contains a little bit more detail and shows you how all of this then works together. Any questions so far?
If I could just pop one question. is there a way that we could easily scale this to, let's just say you want to go and add in, for load testing? How will the app handle if we hit it with 100 concurrent users? Could we use this in that manner? I know you said, it put in the person's name of Joe. We could have it running as Joe, Jack, Tando, whomever.
That's a great question. At the moment, not that I'm aware of. I'm sure that will be one of the things that's coming, although that might potentially, the second part of this discussion where we talk about monitoring, that might help you somewhat, but the normal test studio is not going to give you load testing, unfortunately.
Yeah, not yet, though.
That's a great question, though. All right, so this is a very old application. I think this app is about 3 years old, so it was quite interesting to see when we now hook the monitoring and the testing up to this specific application to see what it does and how it performs and where the problems are. But essentially what we've done, I'm just going to quickly show you what the application does. It's basically a request for a position to be filled in a department. So the manager would go in, it specify the job title. So let's say we're looking for a cook. Required skills is cooking, experience is lots of it, and motivation is okay. So we can now submit this. This particular application connects to an external workflow engine through REST API services to actually understand what's the next step in the process and who's responsible for that, depending on certain business rules and so on. So if we now click on home, you'll see that record is now assigned to HR approval, who is Mike Kent is the responsible person for that. All right, so what we've now done is if we go into the advanced section on the left and we click on open tests, okay, it takes a second, and we've just created these 4 test cases underneath the test suite to basically walk through the process up to a certain step. So first of all, we're going to submit a new request. Then we're going to have human resources send it back with comments. Then the originator is going to send it back to HR, and then HR is going to send it to recruitment, essentially. So in each one of these steps, we've added a bit of extra meat to it. And first of all, you'll see that there's a trace function. So these functions are very easy to add. If I select a step and I click at the top on insert new step above, I can go and insert either an asset, a set property, select, or a trace. So in this case, I've selected a trace, and that then sends trace information with the test information to whichever data source it is. By the way, this is the same trace that you can use to send data through to application insights, which is a very, very interesting topic. But it's exactly the same function that you use in PowerApps. Second thing that we're doing is we're setting a session ID to group all of the feedback, all of the results into one ID. So if I update my various SharePoint lists with all of the test feedback, I can link that back to a specific test session, and I don't have to worry about somehow combining the times in which they ran to understand that they were part of the same session. Then you can go and set the application in a test mode. So think of, and again, you'll see that this is normal PowerApps formula. So we're just setting that variable to true. And what you could do with that is change the workflow notifications on your email notifications to specifically state that this is a test that's busy running. So people shouldn't go and approve purchase orders in SAP based on the information that they might get through email notifications. So that's a very neat trick as well. So then we've added an action to go and count the data that's currently in the data source before we patch the data. And that's important because that's the only way that we know that the data was effectively patched into the data source. And then at the end of this, we are counting that again, and then we're running an asset to understand whether that was successful or not. So if at the end of the process, there's not more records in the data source than what we started off with, then it means that there was a problem. And the asset function basically evaluates this, and if it's false, it'll fail with this reason. And it'll say that this check failed. If it passed, it'll say that this check actually passed. All right, so any other questions before we go and run this and see what it does?
Can you set it up to run on different permissions for different users, for example?
That's a great question as well. I think it depends on how you would specify what permissions are applicable. For an example, if you determine that based on the logged in user, then unfortunately not. But if you build it into the app that you can simulate other roles or levels of roles, then you can actually set the variables in here to actually go and set that to see what it is that you actually want to test. It's important to try and not change the application too much for the testing mode, because then you might actually, nullify your testing. But that's the only way that I can think of that you're going to simulate other users submitting these requests. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Sort of. It's not a pretty answer though. All right, so let's go and step through this and then see what it does. You'll see at the top, again, we've got the play and then the copy play link. We're just going to play it. Just make sure it's published. Okay, so it's thinking about it. And there we go. So you'll see on the left-hand side as it steps through each one of these actions. So it's now set the session ID, set the app test mode. It's counted the data, and now it's actually populating the information in the form. So that's submitting the record. All of that's working well. So at this stage, obviously, you shouldn't click on this. You can actually click on some of these controls, but it might actually mess up the test cases. So just keep the mouse very, very still. So while that's running, I trust that it's going to go through fine. I'm going to show you the SharePoint list that we've created in the back end. It's now going to capture all of this information. So if we go and refresh the test case result, you'll see that there are 2 test cases that we've received information for already. So that's the submit new request, and that was successful, as well as the HR sent back with comments, and that was also successful. And then this has got some of the data around which test case, what the test case ID is, and what the test suite that this belongs to, with a name as well as the IDs for that. So this is now still running, so there's going to be more being submitted to this. So if we refresh it, we'll see there's now 3. And once it's finished with all of the test cases, it'll submit the test suite result. It'll just basically say, out of the total test cases, how many were successful and how many failed. So let's see how far this is. Selecting a recruiter. And I think that is the end of it. So you'll see here it's now going to write the on test case complete and then the on test suite complete. So we should now have information in our SharePoint lists. So there's our 4 test cases that submitted through successfully. All of them are in green, and that's good. And if we go back to our test suite result, you'll see that there's our test all steps test suite. We had 0 failures and 4 passed. All right, so that's in a nutshell where you would then keep track of the various tests that was done on the application. Any questions? Right, so I want to show you the test results and the logic that we apply to that. So we'll see there are these 3 code blocks where we can actually write formula, PowerApps formula on how we would like the application to behave during testing. So typically we want, before every test case starts, we would like it to navigate to the welcome screen. So like I said earlier, the last step of your first case would be the place where the first step on your second case would start. But it might not be a bad idea just to make sure that it navigates to the welcome screen every time, because that's where you then plan your case from. Then on the second column or second code block, we've got on test case complete. So this is what it should do when it now finishes with a test case. And over here, we just have it to call Microsoft Flow and then pass it the entire test case result object. And then we just change that, or convert that into JSON so that Flow can easily just extract that information. And we don't have to go and specify each of these properties as variables in Flow. And then we're also passing it, whether it's a case or like at the bottom, whether it's a suite or a case, so that the logic in Flow will know which SharePoint list to update accordingly. So if we're going to have a look at our our PowerApps or Power Automate Flow, we'll see there are the flow runs that were generated as these test cases were completed. And let's take this one for an example. We can see that this is a case that we received, as is set to the var test type variable. There's the JSON that we received. Okay, so there's all of that information. Here we're stripping the trace information, and because that's currently an array, and we would like to write that into a single SharePoint column, so we need to do some stuff with that. And then we're using a switch statement to determine what logic it should follow for cases and what logic it should follow for suites. And for the case, we obviously need a different schema to pass the JSON with. And then after that, we're going to create the SharePoint item in the case test case list. And similarly, we do for the test suite list. So this won't show on this one because that's a test case. Let's just go and fetch the last one, which now should be a test suite. Yes, it is. And if we expand that, there's the JSON that we've passed of all the information that we received, and then the SharePoint list that we've updated with that information. So there's the total failed is 0 and total passed is 4. So all of that is doing exactly what we wanted it to. So any questions on that? In a nutshell, there's that's what I'm about to show. That's what I'm going to show on testing for this evening. So if there's any other questions on testing, please raise your hand or ask the question.
This was really cool, Dawid. Thanks for sharing. It's definitely something that can add a lot of value.
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, it's on your first app or your first version of the app, it doesn't make sense, and it feels like a waste of time to build these things out. But when in a year from now, when you go and tweak logic and these test cases actually pick up the problem before the users do, that's when the real value of this come to the fore.
100%.
Right, so I can close all of that. So second thing we're going to look at is the monitoring aspect. Now, Michael, you mentioned earlier that stepping through an application that you're not familiar with is tedious, and you 100% right with that. But with the new monitoring functionality, they've made this a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is in the advanced section in the studio, there's this monitor that you can click on, and that allows you to monitor the studio sessions. If I now go and preview this app and I start clicking on things, it's now going to basically write all of the interaction with this app into the monitoring screen. So previously we were able to use the dev tools for this. So if you hit F12 and you go to DevTools, you can see all of the traffic that's generated by the browser to the backend, or back to the server. But unfortunately, this is now very much obfuscated. So you can't, you really have to dig in order to understand what's happening in the developer tools right now. And the reason for this is that all of this information is now written back and it's being shown to you in this monitoring interface in a way that you can easily work with it. All right, so this is very, very handy. So if I go and close this, you'll see even closing a screen creates every single interaction that the app has, and it'll show you whether it's a user interaction or whether it's from a control. So I just want to go and find that function where I clicked on close. So there I closed the record, and it then popped up a runtime message. And I can go and have a look at the actual formula that triggered that as well. So here you can see this is a very old way of how we used to do the pop-up, which we've now built into a component, but this is using exactly the same methodology though. So there you can see where we're collecting the object into the runtime messages collection, and that's what then created that pop-up for you to confirm that you actually want to do close that screen. Then after that, you'll see that that's a user action. Then the user clicked on yes, and that then fired off a change into the collection. And you can actually, exactly like Michael said earlier, step through exactly what happened in the application. And if you spend some time on this, and if you understand JSON, if you don't understand JSON, I would really recommend that you go and there's a lot of tutorials online for how to read basic JSON. You can also go to Dave's Tech Tips. I've done a video on that a month or two ago, but it really helps you to understand JSON. So if I expand the data for this, you'll see that in the data object, it'll show me the exact formula, the duration, what triggered it, and all of these sort of things. So this is hugely helpful. Then there's a formula tab that'll extract just the formula that triggered all of this. So you'll see that this function specifically was triggered by the welcome screen in the onVisible event. And then the highlighted section is what actually caused this thing to run or to happen. So it's very easy to then see what influences or which controls or which formulas influence what areas of the application. So if you want to deep dive into the actual response, so there's no response in this or request response because it's not a network action. But if we go down to the agility get record state as an example, you'll see that this is the request that was sent to the custom connector. And you can see there are the headers that were sent, all of the information that was generated by the app packaged into the header and then sent to the API. And then at the same time, you can go and monitor the response. So you can see the duration, it took 600 milliseconds, the size, the status, which is a 200, and then the body and the response headers that we got back. And here's all of the information that we got back from the workflow engine. And this is then what's building the actual form in PowerApps. Right, so what I'm going to show you as well is, so this has been around for a while being a month or a few months, but they've added some very nice functionality recently, and that makes this a little bit easier to use. So I'm going to close this and I'm just going to show you what they've done recently. And close my test app. So you'll see on the make.powerapps.com, you can now right click on the app and then there's an option to monitor this application. So this is now launching the app in monitor mode. And then from here, I can go and say play published application. So what this now does is it allows you to see everything from the launch in the app. So everything that triggers on app start, everything that triggers on the first screen visible, all of that is now available to you in the actual monitor, in the monitor screen. And you'll see immediately the third item, it's complaining about performance. And what it's saying is that the way in which we're doing the styling in the application is affecting the performance. So just to show you a little bit more of that, we used to do this many moons ago, but essentially in the application we had a template screen, and then on that template screen we would go and set up all of the styling for the application. So colors and font sizes and border sizes and all of these sort of things. And then within the application, we would simply refer the controls back to the template screen for it to understand what color it should be and size and behavior and these sort of things. So that worked well back then, but now what's the monitoring is telling us is that that is affecting the performance of the application, because when the welcome screen is loading, it's now also loading the template screen, where if it could only focus on loading the welcome screen without loading anything else, then the startup time of the app would be, quite a bit faster. And this is then what it shows us with this this orange or this amber line over here. Similarly, if there were any performance issues with regards to the data source, I was actually surprised that there aren't any. The app is actually performing quite well. But if there are any delegation issues or anything else that PowerApps now identifies as inefficiencies, it would highlight them. And then obviously if there are errors, those would return in red. So if we now go and step through this application, let's go and create a new onboarding request. Let's just do test, and submit that. Okay, so that's submitted. If we go back to the monitor, you'll see that there's now a lot of more information that got created as part of that function. And as an example, there's the commit to the database. In this case, this is a SharePoint list, but you can actually go and see the request that was sent through to SharePoint. So there's the body, so there's the object with all of the properties that were sent to SharePoint, and then the response that we got back from it. So Mike, you mentioned earlier that in order to patch a collection to a data source is take some fancy footwork, because you need to make sure that all of the columns match exactly to the destination data source. With this, you can actually see in the response why it's failing. So if you've missed a column that's maybe required, then it'll actually return that in the response. So this helps you so much, I can't explain this. Then again, there's the execute BPM, which is a REST API, and it allows us to go and check the request as well as the response in the greatest of detail. So this really makes your life a whole lot easier. Any questions?
No, it looks good, David. It's really nice to see when there are errors that it picks up, that it does let you know that there's a problem specifically with loading times and performance and that. So that can help a lot, especially when you are troubleshooting. Yeah,
absolutely. So the last thing I want to show you is the fact that you can invite somebody else to join you in the session. Now, this is very useful when you need somebody to help you quickly to troubleshoot something, or you need somebody's opinion on something that's happening in the application. You can simply go and click on the invite at the top. You can then type in the email address for the user. So let's say I'm going to invite Sihle. And from here, I can now copy this link and email it to him. And then what that means is if he opens it up on his side, you'll be able to see this exact same monitor with the app, or for the app that I'm busy working on. And so we could basically do a Teams screen share, and on his side, he can also have access to the session. So he doesn't need to tell me and ask me to go and click here and click there. He can actually troubleshoot on his side as well, while we've got a screen share going. So that's hugely helpful. One of the things that's on the cards that's to come is the fact that, or the functionality, we'll be able to troubleshoot or monitor a user's session. So if a user has a problem on their side, they can launch the app in a specific mode, and that will output this monitoring information through to your monitoring session. So you can actually see what's happening in the back end while the user is simulating the problem. So I think that's going to be a massive massive help for us to do troubleshooting on PowerApps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Just a quick question on that. Would that be any user, like just like a normal user?
Yeah.
Who could also start? Oh, no, that's groundbreaking. That's epic stuff.
Yeah. So that's the idea that you'll be able to, if a user has a problem and you got them on the phone, you can say, well, click on this button or click on this link, which will launch the app in a way that you can monitor the backend and the traffic back to the backend. So that's the idea, and I think that's going to help us a lot.
Sure. Okay. Definitely going to play with that. Cool, man.
I think it also will need to kind of start thinking about what exactly you put in your command, because anybody can read it now, which could cause some security problems.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, look, that's to some extent that's always been the case with PowerApps, because the code is open to other makers. But people with developer tools, could in the past also see some of the traffic that was sent through to the backend. Because everything happens client side, there are some considerations for that. Any other questions? Awesome, guys. So I think that's it from my side. If there's any other questions, please shout out, or if you think of something afterwards, please reach out to us. And Jonathan, then I think we're ready for an open floor discussions.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, David. Really appreciate that. So if there are any questions from anyone, now is the time to raise it. I just want to remind you, if you do want to attend the Power Virtual Agent session, just please click on that link and go and register your interest. We will be setting that up in the next couple of weeks. Okay. But then I just want to open up the floor to everyone. Do you have any general questions and answers, comments, or anything else for anyone? Okay, so I think we take silence as everyone's in agreement that everything's great. Don't need anything else. So with that, everyone, thank you for your time this evening. I hope you found this worthwhile. And you've learned a couple of things. Michael has agreed that he would share his app that he demonstrated, so just pop him a mail or give it a couple of weeks and it will be available on GitHub. David, thanks again for sharing. Really appreciate that. It really helps a lot. And thank you everyone for attending. We do these sessions for you. As usual, if you do have any suggestions or if you want any more information, please reach out to myself, David, or Mike directly, and we'll see how we can accommodate your requests. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening further.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much.